Jonathan Ledgard, spisovatel, futurolog, odborník na umělou inteligenci. Nákladní drony a dronová letiště v Africe nebo stromy a zvířata s digitální identitou. To vše jsou koncepty, jejichž autorem je britský futurolog Jonathan Ledgard. 2 desetiletí pracoval jako zahraničně politický a válečný zpravodaj pro The Economist. Podle jeho knihy Až na dno, inspirované zkušenostmi s islamistickými džihadisty v Somálsku, natočil celovečerní film režisér Wim Wenders. Co by odborníka na pokročilé technologie a umělou inteligenci ho k přednáškám zvou přední evropské univerzity, včetně pražské ČVUT, kde působil jako hostující profesor. Teď Jonathan Ledgard přijel do České republiky na festival dokumentárních filmů v Jihlavě a přijal pozvání do Spotlightu. Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Teresa.
This is not your first time in Prague, of course. How do you, as a futurologist, find this rather ancient and not very futuristic city?
Oh, I would not say. I mean, Prague has to try harder, and the Czech Republic has to try harder. But I do think there is a lot of futurism here. You know, if you look at, I don't know, in the Charles University, in the maths faculty there are some incredible thinkers, some really world-class thinkers on artificial intelligence. Then, of course, in robotics, the Czechs are very, very advanced. So I actually think, even though Prague is obviously very old, quite static, especially architecturally, I would say, in technology, the Czechs are very high-performing, you know.
I was wondering, from the architectural point of view, how can we even accommodate to the possible future needs, you know, because I have, for example, seen in Finland there are robotic, basically robots who are delivering shopping, for example. For sure there are going to be drones delivering all sorts of things in the future, but Prague is very hilly, so what is the concept for such cities? Are we going to stay stagnant, or what are the chances for us?
Well, I think that's the exact question for the Czech political class, right? Is like, to what extent are they willing to push new ideas, new projects? I heard the other day that there was a project for automatic delivery of medicine. So for certain medicines in the rural Czech Republic, you could pick up the medicine from a kind of Alza box, and then of course that was blocked. So I do think here people are very comfortable with what they have, and but of course this economy needs to be churning over a little bit faster. You know.
But Czech Republic, in your point of view, stands well in the field of robotics and sciences, for example, or how?
Yeah, very, very well. I mean, if you look at artificial intelligence, which is something I know a little about, I would say that Prague, you know, you can talk about Bucharest or you can talk about Kiev, but really Prague is the top performing city in the former communist bloc. So I think there is a lot of brain power here, and unfortunately the Ukraine war has brought a lot of young Ukrainians, which is good for Prague, and then of course Slovakia, there's a lot of young Slovaks as well. So Prague, I think, is performing quite well, but I think it could be doing a lot more. It could be doing a lot better. It could be a lot more imaginative, and that's where I always get into trouble. You know, when I'm pushing too hard on this side. But
before we move to your projects, which I definitely want to talk about, I was just wondering, what kind of job is a futurologist? Because, like, I can't really imagine what futurologist is having on mind and on daily duties every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think my wife asked me the same question. So I think, of course, in English, especially for British people, I would never use the term futurologist or thinker or intellectual, because, you know, if you go into a pub in Britain and you say you're any of those things, then people are just going to roll your eyes. And I think that's the same for the Czechs. They're a bit like the British. So I would never personally call myself a futurologist, but I'm very, very interested in the near future, let's say the next 10, 15 years, and in the intersection of security, let's say security and risk, advanced technology, and nature. So if you look at all of the projects I've been doing the last 10, 15 years, they are all really intersecting on those three things. And I don't make any huge claims for a deep future.
Like a deep future.
But I am very interested in what is coming in the next decade or so, because I think, and of course all of your audience, they know this just as well as me, it's a very transformative time.
So what are going to be the biggest challenges in your opinion? Because I was thinking this must be a very negative job. There are people who don't even want to have children because they are scared of the future of the planet, for example. What future do you see?
I'm naturally a deep optimist, and I think if you look under the surface, you actually see quite substantial positive trends. So if you were to take rights for disabled people, and you were to say, are there more rights for disabled people in Africa today or in the Czech Republic today than there were 20 years ago? You say definitely. Is education better? You say definitely. You know, and when we look at technologies, particularly around renewable energy, despite the vested interests attacking those technologies, the price point is coming down and the adoption is there. So I still think there are many optimistic scenarios, and of course there are a lot of cataclysmic scenarios as well. You know.
You are very interested in changes, of course, and particularly one continent, which is Africa, which you say is going to be very affected or could be very affected in the very near future. If I quote, in one of the interviews you said, African countries might collapse if no action is taken because of the rising temperatures on the planet and global warming. There might be a complete collapse of most of the African economies. I don't think that many people in Europe think about how this would influence our continent, even though it is the closest continent to Africa. So how would that scenario, which you claim could happen, influence us, Europeans?
Well, first of all, to say Africa is in certain places already collapsing. Sudan, which is a major country, has completely collapsed. 8 million people displaced. Khartoum, which is a great city, one of the great cities of Africa, is a no-go city. You know, people are, so, and if you go right across that Sahelian belt from Sudan through Niger and Chad and Central African Republic and so on, you see those countries have collapsed in many ways. And what is very interesting to me, and this is a little bit futuristic, Teresa, is this is happening without it being recorded in the media, you know, without it being spoken about in the pub, you know.
So it's not just deserts which are expanding in Africa, but it's the media deserts as well.
Yeah, I think in Europe we are just not engaged, and I can understand why, because people are absorbing that information in feeds, and poverty and ecological stress and political or terrorist insecurity, they don't make it very high up the feed, you know. There are many more shiny stories which are coming up into people's inboxes before they have to worry about Sudan, you know. So it's a really perverse situation that 20 years ago, and we can say even here in Prague, young people would have been better informed about Africa than they are today. You know?
But that's why I'm asking why. Because like people are not going to be interested unless they feel that it could impact their lives.
Well, it is going to impact their lives. There's no there are two scenarios for Africa and Europe. One is an Africa which Europe ignores, has withdrawn its humanitarian aid from, has withdrawn the ability of its diplomats or its military to influence events. And so we see Russians and Chinese, obviously, a much bigger player than Russia, but you see those countries moving into Africa and Europeans feeling guilty moving out, you know. And this, I think, is a disastrous trend for two reasons. One, because it leaves security vacuum, which will definitely manifest in organized crime and mass migration from Africa, you know, towards Europe. And then you will be in a cycle which we are just beginning right now of militarization and criminalization of the movement of people, you know. So that would be a disastrous scenario. But the other scenario is that Europe is in the same time zone as Africa, you know. We have a shared history, you know. This is our neighborhood, and African countries in general, they look to Europe culturally, religiously, in terms of sport, and there should be a corridor there from north to south and south to north, and a lot of these young, brilliant young African workers can really help invigorate European economies, you know. So, of course, that requires political management. Mm-hmm. Of course, it requires imagination. Of course, it requires rule setting and new ways of thinking about our place in the world, you know. But I think if we fail to engage with that, then we will be in a really difficult place, because we'll be more insecure, because we will be poorer, you know. And because Africa is a rich continent, you know. We have, you know, in Africa, a lot of natural resources, and
which are mostly blocked by Chinese by now, aren't they?
No, I think if you look at the trading numbers, Europe is still, I think, if you aggregate Europe, it's still the number one trade partner for Africa. And certainly when we look at deals which are made transparently and legally and so on, which European companies working under European rules tend to be a little bit fairer towards African exporters. So I think there's just an enormous opportunity both ways, and then of course there'll be a double cost if we are not able to be braver and more imaginative. So I'd love to see, you know, here in the Czech Republic, for example, we have funds like PPF. You know, you really want to see PPF, you know, Mrs. Kellnerova say, you know what, 5% of our funds, we're actually going to invest them, even though it's higher risk, but we will invest those funds in Africa because the returns will be higher, and that is actually strategically the right thing to do. So but when you have those conversations, particularly in the Czech environment, people are quite conservative, you know, and people are, you know, obviously not necessarily sympathetic to Okamura and this far right, which is quite exploitative politics, but nevertheless people are like, no, our small town PSEC or wherever, we want PSEC to be PSEC, whatever that means, you know. So we don't want some young Nigerian nurse to come into PSEC. We just, you know, but.
What you could, as a futurologist, do or help to maybe, I don't know, change this, as you say, catastrophic scenarios, is the help of new technologies. You are inventing means how new technologies could help to somehow push this process in a better direction. Together with a renowned architect, Norman Foster, you introduced a drone port prototype of which could somehow help African countries to promote their economy. Can you tell me a bit more about it? Because I was just wondering how drone ports could be really helpful so much.
Of course, we don't want to be megalomaniac or here and say that there are simple solutions to a very complex challenge. But in broad terms, a drone port is just a good, simple example of the ability of economies which have not been built with a 19th century industrial base. They were built as colonial economies, quite extractive. So you would find, if you look at, and I would ask your audience just to glance in an atlas and they can see this for themselves, but if you look at most African countries, you have one port city, one big city inland somewhere, and what that means is all of your secondary towns and the towns after that, they're not very well connected to each other, you know. So you can get to the big city, you can get to the port, but you could be...
But the infrastructure is poor in other...
Infrastructure is poor. So we believe that drones could play some role. Obviously a motorbike is more important, a lorry is more important, railways are fantastic if you can have that infrastructure, but you can also build like a drone fleet infrastructure as well. So you have a town of 20,000 people talking to another town of 20,000 people, and they're sending small stuff back and forward.
So basically you would call it a drone economy?
No, it's just a part of the economy. It's really just about increasing the circulatory flow of the economy. So the metabolic rate of the economy is just moving a little bit faster. And of course goods can move a little bit more cheaply, because incredibly, you know, to move goods in Africa is much more expensive than to move goods within the European Union. If you want to move goods from the Czech Republic to Spain, that's a lot cheaper than moving goods from Kenya into Congo, you know, which is kind of crazy, right?
Yes, but the goods, that was another idea of yours, to have a cargo drone. Is that possible to even, do we have technologies for building such a huge...
Yeah, I think the actual technology, I mean, the great catastrophe of Russian invasion of Ukraine has also accelerated underlying drone technologies and capabilities. You know, I was predicting that we could get to 15, 20 kilos of payload over 200 or 300 kilometers of flight. That's pretty much normal in a military context now, at a price point which is quite low. So absolutely you can move, let's say, suitcase-sized loads of goods, you know, 100, 200 kilometers. Of course, from a government point of view, it's a non-starter right now, because, you know, if you can put a suitcase of clothes or fruit into a drone, you can also put a suitcase of munitions.
That's what I was thinking, actually, so, in the connection of not just the war in Ukraine, but with other conflicts as well, or just use of drone to kill particular targets, particular people, for example. Like if you would develop a huge fleet of drones in African countries, which are not, to put it plainly, one of the most stable countries, how would you make sure that they are not misused?